These are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. This is Ed Salzberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum, and I welcome you to one of our, I think, really important, maybe one of our most important webinars of the year, Killer Heat in the United States, in which we're featuring the recent report by the Union of Concerned Scientists on heat and climate choices and the future of the dangerously hot days. We're really lucky to have two of the lead authors, Rachel Licker and Rachel Cletus, on the line with us, and they are really incredible researchers and bring you to the point of climate action in the report. But we thought that it made sense and really important to go deeper into climate action at the local level. So we invited Antioch University, New England, on, who is a real leader in local approaches to adjusting and adapting to climate change. And I'm really pleased that Michael Simpson, who's the co-director of the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience, along with Abby Abrash-Walton, who's the other co-director in that center, agreed to be on the line with us. Michael is going to be making a presentation, and Abby is going to be moderating the session. So thank you all for participating with us. Please take the brief exit survey at the end. That really helps us improve the webinar, so it gives us important feedback. We make all of our sessions free. The kind of entry price, all we ask is that you take the exit survey. You can download the slides now in the GoToWebinar handout box. You can also download the report there, and there's also some information about the climate resilience certificate program that Antioch University offers. It's a university that is really at the forefront of climate action at the local level. Just a little bit of information about the Security and Sustainability Forum. If you don't know where you are, we have a lot of followers, 25,000. We make all of the webinars educational, top quality. We attract the best people in the world onto the sessions and cover the major issues and work with just some amazing sponsors and funders that make us able to do these sessions and make them free. The one conference every year that I go to is the National Council for Science and Environment in Washington, D.C. And the reason I go to that one is because it's all about sound science informing policy. And so that's the center of gravity for SSF, and it's the center of gravity for the National Council for Science and the Environment. It's in January every year. And you can get a 15% off discount using this discount code right here. You can click on the slide to get over to the conference site. Just recommend that you consider coming to the session. The 15% off makes a reasonably priced conference very affordable, down around a little more than $500 to participate, which is amazing for 3 days of education. We have a lot of webinars coming up. I'm not going to go over all of these, but we have another one this week. I hope you can join in on Power to the People on microgrids. We're looking at ways to make mini grids in developing nations affordable. And the week after that, another ASU webinar on the negative emissions industry, and then several others. So I put in all the webinars that are coming up. The ones in blue are you can register now; they're active. The other ones are on the list, in planning, ready to go. Oops. Okay, here's how the session is going to work. I'm going to do the introduction, which I'm doing right now. I'm going to introduce Abby, who will then do a small presentation of an overview and launch us into the presentations. And then in the order presentations will be Rachel Licker, Rachel Cletus, and then Michael Simpson, following up with really strong examples about action that can be taken at the local level. Flooding and other threats are local or regional. Heat is global, so it's a transformation in thinking, and Michael's going to be talking about that. You can add your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We're going to end this with a panel summary, and then you can download the slides now, as I had mentioned, in the GoToWebinar window. Please do that. It's nice to follow along, especially with the slides themselves. I said the report's there, and the climate resilience certificate program information is there as well. The video will be posted shortly, and in the chat box I put the information about the conference, the NCSC conference, in there. I just feel strongly about this conference being one that sustainability professionals should consider coming to. Okay, So as you know now, Abby is the co-director of the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience. And I met Abby several years ago, and I've been up to Antioch University in New England. They just have an incredible dedication to local climate action, which is why I wanted Abby and Michael on this session to really round it out. And Abby has a really unique background. She has a doctorate in environmental science, environmental action from Antioch, but she also went to the London School of Economics, and I just have a great deal of respect for anyone who graduated from that program. And she has a background really centered on how people come to judgment and behavioral science, which I think is just really important in this business. So with that, Abby, I'm going to turn the session over to you to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you to all three panelists for being here for today's broadcast. And I get to have the fun and the privilege of moderating today's session, beginning with telling you a little bit about the three folks you're going to be hearing from. So I'm going to start with Dr. Rachel Licker, who serves as Senior Climate Scientist with the Climate and Energy Program at UCS, Union of Concerned Scientists. And in that role, Dr. Licker communicates climate science to policymakers, the public, and the media. She also analyzes new developments in climate science and works to defend climate science budgets and programs, which, you know, honestly, Rachel, may be one of the most important things that you do in your work. keep defending those budgets. But prior to joining UCS, Dr. Licker completed an American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And for her fellowship, she served as a foreign affairs officer with the U.S. Department of State, where she managed its work with the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund. Before that, Dr. Licker completed postdoctoral training at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And during that time, she also served as a chapter scientist and contributing author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Working Group #2. So just a really, really impressive background in the science and the communication of our changing climate, and I'm really happy that she's here with us today. I next want to introduce you to Dr. Rachel Cletus, who serves as Policy Director with UCS's Climate and Energy Program. And she leads the program's efforts in designing effective and equitable policies to address climate change and advocating for their implementation. So Dr. Cletus brings nearly 20 years of experience working on U.S. climate and clean energy policies. She is also an expert on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process and has been attending international climate negotiations since 2009. Prior to joining UCS, she worked as a consultant for the World Wildlife Fund, conducting policy-focused research on links between sustainable development, trade, and ecosystems in Asia and Africa. And she also worked for TELUS Institute in the Energy and Environment Program, and Michael Simpson also worked at TELUS Institute way back when. So that's a little bit of background about both of them. On a side note, I'll just say that I'm headed out this afternoon to go down to present to the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows tomorrow morning. And it's always really wonderful to see where AAAS S&T Policy Fellows go. It's such a great fellowship, and for those of you who are listening to this broadcast and who are thinking about informing policy and translating research so that it makes a difference in terms of policy, I encourage you to think about becoming a AAAS Fellow. So our third panelist is Michael Simpson, my colleague here at Antioch University, New England. And Michael has been a senior environmental scientist and a partner for 2 environmental consulting firms here in the Northeast. He's also worked for both the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and also the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Michael is a licensed wetland scientist with more than 25 years experience in wetland and riparian corridor assessments, employing a variety of assessment approaches and data collection procedures. And much of his research has been funded by NOAA and also by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It focuses on working with local stakeholders to identify potential risks from projected climate and land use change, and has been followed by developing an adaptation strategy for communities to build for projected impacts. So we have a really terrific panel here today, and that's background about all three of our presenters. So Ed, if you'd move us on to the next slide. I think here you see the mission statement for Antioch Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience. We started the center in 2014 as our first commitment to the White House Climate Data Initiative, and have a very focused mission on strengthening communities to prepare, respond, and recover in the face of climate impacts through collaborative, innovative solutions. And our focus is really on local scale decision makers, people working at the municipal and county levels within watersheds, and for community-based organizations. So that's the mission that we have here at the center. And Ed, if you'd go to the next slide, I want to tell you that our most recent commitment to this mission has been to start a new climate resilience certificate and course series. And these are 4-week online 1-credit courses. You can take all of them, you can take one of them. It's very much up to participants about which topic areas they want to engage with. Michael right now is teaching one on climate science, uncertainty and risk. But Ed, if you'd go to the next slide, I just want to give a heads up that the next 1-credit course that we'll be offering is being delivered by our colleague, Dr. Krista Daniels. This one focuses on vulnerability and adaptation planning and has a lot of relevance for today's topic. So if you're looking to build your capacity in these areas, I would encourage you to take a look at the course series. Michael and Krista are wonderful instructors. Okay, that's it for my introduction, and I'm going to hand it now over to Dr. Rachel Licker. Thanks, Rachel.
Great. You have slide control, Rachel, and I just want to remind people to put questions in the question box.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ed. Well, thank you again for this opportunity to speak and share the results from our new report, Killer Heat. Again, Rachel Cletus and I are both from the Union of Concerned Scientists, where our goal and overarching mission statement is science for a healthy planet and a safer world. So the report that we are going to be talking about today, Killer Heat in the United States, Climate Choices and the Future of Dangerously Hot Days, is a new analysis that the underlying work was published in a peer-reviewed journal called Environmental Research Communications. So you can find that available as open access online. And then we have this synthesis report, which is sort of our more public-facing version of the same analysis and report findings that we'll be talking about here. So with respect to why did we do this analysis, I always like to start here. And what you'll see is a graph from the National Weather Service with the number of weather fatalities from last year, 2018, where you'll see the numbers from last year, 2018, in red, with a 10-year average, 2009 to 2018 in blue, and a 30-year average, 1989 to 2018 in yellow. So you'll see the y-axis ranges from 0 to 140, and then you'll see a number of different types of weather events, everything from flooding, lightning, tornadoes, and obviously I want to point out heat, which you'll see smack in the center, and that is currently the top weather-related cause of death in the United States. But we really saw that the type of information that was available to communicate how extreme heat is likely to change as a result of climate change had some gaps. Most notably, the type of information available was not always in terms of the extreme heat in the way that U.S. residents are most familiar with, and that would be the heat index. And we also didn't see information on projections in terms in a very fine spatial resolution. So those were some of the gaps that we were seeking to fill with our analysis. So what we actually did was we collaborated with Professor John Abotskloo from the University of Idaho. And he produced very, very high resolution climate projections using 18 different climate models, the standard ones that are used in the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC. The projections are so fine resolution, you can just imagine a grid being plopped over the United States and each grid cell box being about 2 miles by 2 miles big. So really incredibly detailed projections for this century. And we looked at a few different scenarios of climate change, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what we did was we used Professor Abatsoglu's projections of humidity, relative humidity, and maximum temperature, and we ran them through the National Weather Service heat index equation to calculate the number of, or the heat index values for the century, and how they compare with a historical baseline, and then looked at a few different relevant thresholds. We did this for every community in the lower 48 states. And I'll get to the thresholds that we looked at in a moment too. So the thresholds that we looked at and why. First of all, we were really interested in understanding the effects of heat stress and heat illness and extreme heat conditions on outdoor workers. We wanted to know how are conditions likely to change for this particular part of the United States. So for starters, we looked at changes in the number of days where the heat index exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's the threshold above which OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, recommends employers start issuing guidance to protect their employees, because that's the threshold above which people can begin becoming susceptible to heat illness. We also looked at the heat index above 100 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and the reason why we chose those two is because depending on where you live in the United States, above those two thresholds, the National Weather Service starts recommending that heat advisory alerts start being issued. So above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you see a situation in which children, elderly adults, pregnant women, people with underlying health conditions are at increasing risk for heat illness. Above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, anyone really can be at risk, and there can even be a risk of death as a result of heat-related illness. And then we also looked at what we call off-the-charts days, because when we set out to do this study, we were really interested in just looking at how things are likely to change using the National Weather Service heat index equation. We actually found ourselves in a situation where we couldn't reliably calculate the heat index value anymore because it was just getting so hot in some locations. Because the heat index equation is meant to work for all but the most extreme conditions on Earth. And the only place in the United States currently that has conditions that are so hot that you can't apply the National Weather Service heat index equation is in the Sonoran Desert at the US-Mexico border. They have days per year where the conditions are that bad. And so we found ourselves in a situation where then we were literally breaking the National Weather Service heat index equation. And so we started flagging those days, and we'll get to those results in a moment. And we often get asked, you know, what would that feel like? And the best way we can put it is it would feel at least as hot as 127 degrees Fahrenheit, but when you factor in humidity, it would feel worse. So with respect to heat-related illness, you know, also maybe perhaps to just back up for a moment, a lot of projections for extreme heat are in terms of just temperature alone, but humidity is such an important part of the experience of heat. It makes it obviously more difficult for the body to sweat and to efficiently cool itself. So we really, that's why we were so interested in getting at the heat index, because we really, it's a very important portrayal of the conditions and of the experience of extreme heat, and is directly tied to all of these different aspects of heat-related illness. So some of the different symptoms of heat-related illness that I'm showing here range from minor, you know, something perhaps as a dry mouth or a headache, to things that can be more life-threatening, obviously stroke or a coma, a heart attack, and they include both conditions that are, you know, due to heat alone, as well as conditions that are related to the exacerbation of pre-existing conditions. So heat, what I'm trying to say there is that heat exacerbates a number of pre-existing health conditions, everything from cardiovascular and respiratory disease. And there are also a variety of medications that people can be on, things like medications to lower blood pressure. There are a number of antidepressants that make it difficult for the human body to regulate its own temperature. And so it can make certain populations more vulnerable to heat-related illness. So again, as I mentioned before, we looked at a number of different scenarios. So the ones that we looked at, first of all, the historical baseline. So we looked at the last 20 years of the most recent century. So we looked at about 1979 to 2000. And that served as the baseline for the number of days above these different thresholds that I mentioned. And then we looked at 3 different global warming scenarios. First of all, a scenario in which we took essentially no action and have no policies on climate change, a scenario in which we take slow action and where emissions about stabilize and then start to decline around mid-century, and a scenario in which we took what we call rapid action and met the Paris Climate Agreement's goal of keeping temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So some of our results, just nationwide, starting with mid-century, you'll see here a few different maps. One is showing the historical values, so historically how many days nationwide have been above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and how many have been experienced a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll see the key at the bottom with the different colors and what they represent. Obviously, as you get more and more closer to red or red, more days above these thresholds. And then we have a scenario in which we took no action on climate change at mid-century, and you can compare and see the difference. So here we see that nationwide at mid-century, if we fail to take any action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the number of days with a heat index above 100 would double. And by late century, I'm getting ahead of myself, and the number of days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit would quadruple. At late century, so the 2070 to 2099 period, we would really see a situation of unprecedented heat. Here we're showing that there would be, if we took no action on climate change, 8 times as many days with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and a huge expansion of the number of days that would experience some level of what we called off-the-charts heat days. Again, noting that the only part of the country that experienced any amount of those days historically was at the in the Sonoran Desert at the U.S.-Mexico border. You can see places as far as Wisconsin, Michigan, for example, would be in a situation where they would experience some level of those days. We also, as I mentioned, these data are available at a very fine resolution. I presented the nationwide results, but with some of the tools that we have available on our website, you can actually go into a variety of different spatial scales. So you can look at things at county level, congressional district level, and see what's happening in your area of interest. So here I have pulled out a few examples. So for example, Maricopa County in Arizona, where Phoenix is located, with no action at late century, would see 119 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. McLean County, Illinois, 67 such days. Hillsborough, Florida, where Tampa is located, 156. And Washington, D.C., where I'm located, 68. So you can play around on our website with the different scenarios and different time periods and see how things are likely to change relative to historical. It's a really powerful tool. You can download congressional district fact sheets and it really, you can get pretty specific here. So given the audience that we're speaking with right now, obviously these are really, it's a powerful source of information and can really help paint a picture in a deep way about how conditions are likely to change. And from there, you can think about the consequences for a variety of different sectors and populations. So one thing we wanted to flag, obviously we look nationwide, but in cities, one thing I did want to note is that we are only looking at the results that are the results of the consequences of global warming. We didn't look at changes in any land use, and obviously the urban heat island effect, in which cities are warmer than the surrounding regions because of the pavement absorbing heat during the day and re-radiating it out at night, as well as heat from engine combustion and such. Some of our results could actually be a bit conservative for cities when you consider some of those additive effects. But what I'm showing here is that at mid-century, if we took no action on climate change, there would be 150 cities with 30 or more days in an average year with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And moving to the next slide, at late century, if we took no action, you can see how that value would creep up, how many even more northerly cities would experience more than a month's worth of these kinds of extreme conditions each year. And compared with a scenario in which we met the Paris Climate Agreement, you can see how that number would drastically shrink, the number of cities with these kinds of extreme heat conditions. So the main takeaways here, before I pass along to my colleague Rachel, failing to take action on climate change to reduce, failing to take action to reduce emissions would really lead to a staggering expansion of dangerous heat and would really have significant consequences for the life that we live at home, at school, at work. And aggressively reducing emissions could contain that expansion. So the time to act really is now. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Rachel, who will take us through how we could get there and fill in some of that in more detail.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for sharing some of these really profound results from our report. What I'm going to do next is talk us through some of the implications of these results for what we need to do as a nation to, first of all, curtail these kinds of impacts, as well as keep people safe from the kinds of extreme heat that Rachel pointed out are a great risk to communities and people around the country. So in our report, we also lay out a set of solutions along these two major themes. One around adaptation, the fact that even if we do our utmost to curtail emissions, the reality is that we have already baked in some amount of extreme heat due to current and past emissions. And so we've got to make sure that we're doing our best to keep people safe from these conditions. And at the same time, as Rachel pointed out, we do still have choices. And the most important choice we have right now is to help curtail runaway climate change by limiting emissions in line with what the IPCC and other major scientific reports are pointing out is necessary to keep temperatures from rising beyond 1.5 or 2 C. So in our report, we talk about both these pieces, and around climate mitigation, we talk about doing our utmost here in the US to contribute to global efforts to curtail heat trapping emissions by reaching net zero emissions by 2050, at least net zero emissions by 2050, if not more. So I'm going to start a little bit with the resilience, the adaptation measures around keeping people safe. There's obviously the need for coordinated action, both from the local to the state to the national level in terms of how we go about doing this. We need better coordination across all levels of government. We need to have the kinds of data and information that will let people know ahead of time when these dangerous heat conditions are coming. So heat early warning systems that the National Weather Service and others are already in the process of implementing need to be enhanced, and we need to invest in the kinds of budgets, the federal budgets, that will allow these kinds of systems to be well developed and state of the art. We obviously need emergency response plans, and those emergency response plans need to recognize that there are some populations that are incredibly vulnerable to the effects of heat. And those include outdoor workers, they include the elderly, they include people with pre-existing health conditions. We know that low-income populations and communities of color are often disproportionately exposed to heat impacts, including the exacerbation of them through the urban heat island effect. So any emergency response plans that we're developing need to be able to identify these especially vulnerable populations and target resources to them. We talk about cooling standards for public housing. We talk about the need to invest in cooling infrastructure at the community level, making sure that the elderly, low-income communities have access to cooling centers, have access to bill assistance programs that will allow them to, for example, run their air conditioners during heat waves. If they don't have air conditioning in public housing, what can we do as a nation to upgrade the public housing infrastructure to include cooling standards? We also think it's really important to have protective utility disconnect policies. This is an issue that the NAACP in particular has been elevating as a key point, that during extreme heat and extreme cold, it's life-threatening to have electricity turned off, whether it's for bill non-payment or other reasons. And it's really important. Right now, we have sort of a patchwork all around the country where different states have different approaches to utility disconnect. And we need to make sure that these policies are taking into account the kinds of threats that extreme heat is bringing. And then finally, we know that in addition to people, our infrastructure that people rely on to keep healthy and safe is also very vulnerable to extreme heat. Whether we're talking about things like transportation infrastructure, our healthcare services, a range of types of infrastructure are really vulnerable. Our power sector infrastructure is very stressed by extreme heat events. So we've got to start investing in the kind of infrastructure that will be climate resilient and forward-looking in light of the extreme heat projections that Rachel shared earlier in the presentation. One piece that we've been working in collaboration with a coalition of other groups on is the National Occupational Safety Standards for heat. This is legislation that was introduced, HR 3668, named after Asuncion Valdivia, was introduced by Representative Grijalva and Representative Chu. It is named after a gentleman who died over 10 years ago while picking grapes in California in 105-degree heat. He got extremely ill and then ultimately succumbed to this heat-related illness. And right now, we don't actually have occupational safety standards that are uniform around the country. And this particular piece of legislation is asking for OSHA to set these federal standards for both indoor and outdoor workers in honor of Mr. Valdivia, and also to make sure that workers get regular breaks, that when temperatures go above a certain threshold, it immediately sets into motion the kinds of protective measures that would need to be taken to protect their safety and well-being. The other thing that we're trying to do is to make sure that we also are thinking about what it will take to transition our nation away from fossil fuels, because it's obviously the heat trapping emissions from our dependence on fossil fuels that's fueling climate change. We need to be looking across our economy, the power sector, the transportation sector, the industrial sector, to cut emissions as quickly as possible. And this will require transitioning us away from our current dependence on fossil fuels to building a clean energy economy where we're getting most of our energy from renewable low carbon sources, We're ensuring that we're electrifying as many energy end uses as possible. So as we're transitioning to low carbon electricity, we're also making sure that more and more sectors in our economy, whether it's electric cars or electrifying industrial processes, heating, cooling, et cetera, to lower carbon emissions across the economy. At the same time, we need to make sure that this transition to a clean energy economy is done in a just and equitable way so that the workers and communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuels have an opportunity to diversify their local economies and participate in the benefits of this clean energy transition. Also, so that communities that currently have a disproportionate burden from the emissions from fossil fuel power plants and transportation and industry can benefit directly as we transition away from fossil fuels. For example, recently in the last few months, we've seen a renewable electricity standard introduced at the federal level by Senator Udall. Senator Smith introduced a clean energy standard. These are all opportunities at the federal level to advocate for the policies that would be needed to ensure this transition in the power sector. Around the country, different states also have renewable electricity standards that again provide the opportunity from the state level up to demonstrate the benefits of the economic and the public health benefits of transitioning away from fossil fuels to low carbon forms of electricity. If we do this right, this can also really benefit consumers' pocketbooks. So transitioning, for example, to cleaner vehicles that are more efficient means that you would be using less gas. Creating more mass transit, clean mass transit opportunities would allow low-income communities and others to also benefit directly from lower carbon forms of transportation, and at the same time close some of the gaps that we currently have where some communities just don't have access to mass transit and other clean transportation options. We also, through this heat report, have created a website with a lot of really rich materials. Rachel mentioned some of the localized material that we have available. If you go to our website, you will see there's a widget, data widget embedded there. You see it on the right here. You can just type in your city or county, and it will tell you right down to the county level, wherever you are in the lower 48, what extreme heat projections look like. All of this is, there's a lot of this material available in Spanish language as well. We've also created congressional district fact sheets, 433 of them for the lower 48, all the congressional districts. The opportunity here is to make this information as relevant as possible wherever people live. Many of you will be interested in advocating at the local and state level with your policymakers, in addition to federal policymakers. And this kind of information can really customize it and make it immediately relevant to wherever you live. We are encouraging folks to use this as much as possible. It's readily downloadable. And we also, as Rachel pointed out in the beginning, UCS strongly believes that we get the best policymaking process, a science-informed policymaking process, when ordinary citizens are empowered with this kind of information, and you all go off and advocate based on it. We have a science network with close to 26,000 scientists. If any of you are scientists or technical experts, we invite you to join it. If you're not a scientist, we still need you too. We have a huge supporter network and encourage you to join that. And then finally, if you have any questions for Rachel or I based on the information we presented, we very much welcome emails. And please do go to our website where we have, as I mentioned, a lot of information related to this heat report. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Abby here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I just want to underscore the importance of the resources that the Union of Concerned Scientists have created and that Rachel just spoke about. Having those congressional district fact sheets is just an incredible resource for building capacity for that kind of advocacy within districts. The other thing that you presented, Rachel, that I find to be super effective is the tool that UCS has put together so that you can actually go in and look at your own location and understand what the projections show high heat days to be mid-century and late century. And that's another just wonderful tool. And then I also really appreciate that in the Killer Heat report, there's such an emphasis on storytelling and the examples of real people who are already being affected by the changing climate. And we often talk in climate change communication about the need to focus on here, now, and us as a framework for communication. The fact that it's happening here in the places where we live, work, and play, that it's happening now, and that it's happening to us. It's not just happening to polar bears in the Arctic. So I really applaud UCS's work, and I have found those particular tools to be immensely helpful. So I want to now turn it over to my colleague, Michael Simpson. Michael is going to be presenting on response to the threat of extreme heat through that lens of an emphasis on what people can be doing at the local level. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I want to personally thank both Rachel Licker and Rachel Cletus and the Union of Concerned Scientists for elevating heat to be considered on par with the other major impacts from climate change, such as sea level rise and extreme precipitation events that one often sees in the press media. And I'll build upon the information that Rachel Cletus introduced. Now, most of the participants in today's webinar are cognizant that many temperature records were broken this summer, not only in the US, but also during the heat wave in Europe. I just want to make sure I have control of the slides here.
Michael, just left click. There you go.
Okay, great. We're seeing that such extremes are becoming more common. For example, since the beginning of this century, we saw 2 extreme events to hit Europe and Russia. Besides the mortality, there were associated impacts to transportation, water supply, and energy delivery infrastructure. Unto themselves, it is difficult to attribute a changing climate to these particular weather events. What we can learn from them is the scale of the vulnerability of our existing systems. And the UCS report is pointing to a future in which such extreme events will become more commonplace in the US. So how can we begin to respond and plan for such events? Luckily, in the US, there's already a mechanism in which states and communities prepare for possible hazards. Hazard mitigation planning is an essential component of Homeland Security, and it's administered through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and all states and tribal nations are required to have a hazard mitigation plan. And many of those states also require that each community also have such a plan. However, as you can see, there are many parts of the country that have not developed such a plan, or their plans are outdated. Such plans can be developed within specific municipal departments by municipal staff, but from our experience, the most robust process for plan development is a multi-stakeholder input from various municipal departments and the general public, including the business sector. One of the major activities of the planning process is to recognize potential hazards into the future, determine the exposure of those impacts within the community, and inventory the current systems in place within the community that may help mitigate such impacts. And what comes out of such a planning process is a prioritized list of threats by exposure risks. Now, this is based both on the likelihood of an event occurring and the relative scale of the exposure to the community. And this is where the information created by UCS will resonate. Communities will be searching for legitimate information to ascertain how important any particular hazard should be considered for a community. And with UCS's accessible web-based tool, hazard mitigation planners have a resource to see the potential scale of future impacts for their particular area. Now, a specific plan for response for an extreme heat needs to be subsequently developed. The state of Minnesota has come up with a good structure or framework for developing an emergency response plan. Many other states have done that, but I chose Minnesota because most people wouldn't think they would be considering heat as a priority, but they are. Minnesota has come up with a structure on how to plan and respond for such events. It begins with designating a responsible agency or municipal department which can take the lead in ensuring that the plan is created, that the plan is implemented during extreme events, and the implementation is evaluated to improve the plan for future response. But two things should be emphasized here: that there needs to be multiple stakeholders involved, not just the health and medical establishment. For example, the proprietors of where there may be heat refuge sites are essential. You need to coordinate with first responders. You definitely need to work with organizations that represent vulnerable populations, just to name a few. And to this last point, when looking at vulnerable populations, one must then consider the special steps that may be needed to be taken to communicate with and support them during such an event. A recent applied research project in Bridgeport, Connecticut by Antioch faculty associated with our Climate Center focused on how to involve the elderly in climate response planning due to extreme heat events. The creation of the resultant plan involved not only the voice of the elderly themselves, but multiple public sector and NGO stakeholders. And even within the health and medical domain, there are other populations beyond those with respiratory or cardiovascular related challenges. Recognizing and addressing these populations require coordination with agencies other than just the medical community. Now, one of the initial emergency planning steps is to locate properties that can act as refuge points from the heat. And it has been done here in LA. Many of these can be public facilities such as schools, libraries, or recreation facilities. But some may need coordination with the private sector to make these properties available during emergencies. But besides the space, there needs to be some assurance that such cooling centers can operate when energy demand is at its peak. Thus, redundancy in supplying energy to cooling capacity is a must here. This is so because at the larger regional scale, systems may be vulnerable to extended extreme heat, which is some of the lessons we have learned from previous extreme heat events. In the US in 2006, the California heat wave, Los Angeles saw more than 80,000 people left without electricity for several days. And in the northern part of the state, there were 1.2 million PG&E customers that experienced electricity shortages when 1,150 distribution line transformers failed due to overheating. And as Rachel mentioned, both Rachels mentioned, there is this densely populated urban areas. We have additional impact for what is known as the heat island effect, which is due to all the thermal mass of roads and buildings which absorb and re-radiate heat, often combined with a lack of air movement amongst the city structures. Research has shown that heat islands can increase the ambient temperatures on the order of 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the surrounding landscape. Concurrently, such a temperature rise contributes to energy demand. Now, as one can see here from research by ASU, in certain parts of the country, pavement temperatures can reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit. These are surfaces on which you can literally fry an egg. However, there's a relatively low-cost first response to such heating within urban heat islands, and that is to transform the surface of roads and buildings to a more reflective surface. That is to increase the community's albedo. This example shows that this could have a 10-degree Fahrenheit reduction in absorbed heat to surfaces. Now, the use of albedo actually made the rail system in Austria, which has been coated white, more resilient to this summer's heat wave as compared to what was happening to rail infrastructure in Great Britain over the same amount of time. Now, to develop more reflectance for sunlight, one of the easiest ways is to simply choose a lighter color aggregate for paving. In our major thoroughfares, as you are making choices between concrete roads and asphalt, it seems concrete may be the way to go. However, there may be unintended consequences of choosing concrete as a road surface, especially if required maintenance is deferred. A concrete pavement blow-up occurs in extreme heat when the roadway surface expands at a crack or joint where moisture has seeped in. Now, in a densely populated communities, besides increasing reflectance of the road surfaces, rooftops are another target for planning in municipal building codes. Besides reducing the potential of sunlight hitting the thermal mass, and having cooler internal building temperatures will lessen the demand for air conditioning. Air conditioners which pumps heat out into the urban heat island and drives up peak energy demand. And as the UCS report indicates, there will need to be a significant shift in thinking about this future heat as an emergency. Thus, beyond the hazard mitigation planning and the associated emergency response measures, such considerations will need to be integrated into longer-term community planning. And one important initial focus to such planning is how to effectively address the socioeconomic disadvantages of segments of the community populations. What you see here is a very recent analysis by researchers at Howard University in conjunction with the National Public Radio, showing a correlation between surface heat impact and income levels of neighborhoods. It is the citizens in such economically disadvantaged neighborhoods who may lack the resources to even purchase energy cooling fans or air conditioners, and may also be living in areas where it is not wise to provide potential access into buildings through window-mounted units. So, at a minimum, the community should consider such disadvantaged areas as prime candidates for placing cooling centers. Now, I was fortunate that our center had recently convened its biannual Eastern U.S. Climate Preparedness Conference in the Baltimore area. We got to see firsthand how the city was quite segmented, not only by housing stock, but by associated tree cover. And there are correlations between which segment of the population's areas benefit from tree cooling canopy. And from a community planning and implementation perspective, to build or expand an urban forest will take time. And based on the UCS results today, this effort should not wait. Research has shown that tree canopy is a very wise long-term investment for a community. And if spread equitably throughout the community, it provides non-energy demand natural respite from heat, not only in the direct shade cooling for citizens, but limiting overall heating of the city's thermal mass. And strategically, how one chooses where to plant not only provides cooler pavements and sidewalks, but cooling associated buildings will go a long way in reducing both a community's heat island effect and the peak demand for energy. Now, a simple tool that can be used in tandem with GIS is iTree. Besides utilizing it to project future tree establishment initiatives, it can quantify co-benefits from removal of air pollutants and even quantify carbon sequestration over time. And when considering expanding tree cover and providing respite from heat, there is potential co-benefits to the overall well-being of the community itself. Proactive approaches such as urban forestry can have unintended consequences for the community as a whole. For example, police agencies have long known with heat comes a spike of crime. And with cooling, this may mitigate some of that. Other societal co-benefits that researchers have seen associated with urban forestry, which is particular, can benefit the most socioeconomic challenged segments of the community, is business attraction, increase in property values, and an increase in overall community pride within the neighborhoods. And on a larger scale, communities need to consider how the footprint of buildings are developed over time, not only to ensure more opportunities for what we call city shade canyons, but also taking into account natural weather patterns and air circulation, so to ensure there is an ability for natural convection cooling and avoidance of stagnant air. In this regards, one may look to the past of how communities have developed over the centuries to address mitigation of heat impacts through well-designated shade canyons, utilizing natural air cooling potential and earth ball cooling, enhancing the albedo effect of the municipal landscape, utilizing natural vegetation to cool spaces through evapotranspiration. Now, both this experience with living within heat environments combined with new groundbreaking concepts and materials will need to be at the forefront of urban planning, architectural design, and engineering education and training if we're going to make a rapid shift to respond to the future that the UCS scientists have projected for us. I will end with two useful primers for framing responses to such future extreme heats. The first is this publication from Georgetown's Climate Center. Also, EPA has some excellent information at their Heat Island site. Now I'd like to turn things back over to Abby.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to all three presenters today. So next, everybody, we are going to dive in with questions from registrants for this webinar to our panelists. And I want to begin with a very, very practical and pragmatic question. This comes from Joya Patel, who asks this question: how can local health departments play a role in climate change education and planning? So really emphasizing the role that local health departments at the municipal level, especially, or the county level, might play.
I'll take the first shot at that, and then the Rachels may want to jump in. But one thing we have found in communities is that often you see a balkanization of municipal agencies. Even though you think they talk to each other, they often don't. And so it's important for an overarching agency or even leadership within the community to bring these disparate municipal experts together in order to discuss how they may proceed. And so you see in many cities, you do see the health departments take sort of the lead on coming up with information and strategies to communicate to the populace. On the other hand, you have the people that are dealing with hazardous risk. You also see people that are doing this through emergency response. You also see this through the Department of Public Works dealing with more infrastructure-related systems. So one of the aspects is trying to bring together all stakeholders into the single room and try to address the program. So I'll pass it on.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think the unique opportunity at the state and local and municipal level is really understanding who's most vulnerable and affected. And it's not just about climate projections and extreme heat. which affects us all, but it does disproportionately affect certain populations. You need to be seeing how is your homeless population faring, outdoor workers, including police force folks, your local schools. Many of our schools in the Northeast, for example, where I live, don't have air conditioning because they never needed it in the past. But now more and more, we're seeing these extreme heat events. You've got to be careful about school kids, outdoor activities like sports. So it's really about that opportunity to identify what are the risks at the local level and engaging with those local stakeholders, both government stakeholders, but also community stakeholders, to understand how they can protect themselves, spreading information about cooling centers, bill assistance programs, giving people an awareness ahead of time when these heat waves are coming, and giving them the tools to be able to protect themselves better. And then there's a real important role where we need to put pressure on federal policymakers to do the right thing here, both in terms of helping protect people as well as limiting carbon emissions that are fueling climate change. That demand must come from the local to the national. Right now, we have a Congress and an administration that is completely derelict when it comes to addressing the challenge of climate change. They need to answer to their constituents at the local level.
I'm going to say here to that, Rachel, and we're doing a policy advocacy class right now through Antioch. It's an online course. I've posted the link over in the sidebar there. And again, I just want to emphasize the importance of the congressional district fact sheets that UCS has created, because those are phenomenal tools to provide anyone with the right talking points and the right evidence-based approaches to talking with legislators and other policymakers about this issue. So get out there, talk to people in your districts. It's not difficult. They all have to come home to campaign. And even if they're not there, their staffers are there. So it's actually very easy. You don't have to travel to Washington, D.C. to talk with your policymakers. You can do it right where you live. And it's essential. I always think about our neighbor up the road here in New Hampshire, Doris Granny D. Haddock, who at the age of 90 walked across the country in support of campaign finance reform. And one of her statements that I love and that I use all the time is, democracy is not something that we have, it's something that we do. It's an action. We have to be involved. We have to bring this to the attention of our policymakers. So thank you, Rachel, for really underscoring that. I next want to go to a question here that comes from Rob Bartnick. And Rob is referencing British Columbia's recently released climate adaptation strategy, and noting that that PDF, and I think maybe we can copy and paste this PDF into the chat box so everybody can see it, reflects the expected catastrophic effects to the economic sector, including results from 25% loss of forest area and similar harms to fisheries and farming. And Rob is asking, is there a similar resource available for the US that looks specifically at the economic impacts?
Yeah, so what I would say is one of the most authoritative reports we've had in the last year is from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the fourth National Climate Assessment, that actually has a chapter in it that talks about the economic impacts of climate change and the health impacts of climate change. And the effects of extreme heat on labor is one of the biggest pieces of the cost of climate change that they identify, but they also talk about other sectors that are exposed. So for example, sea level rise is putting a lot of really many communities around the country at risk from coastal flooding. There's a lot of people living there. There's a lot of expensive property in the path of this sea level rise. So they identify different huge categories of impact. So if we could drop in a link to the National Climate Assessment as part of the notes, that would be great. Folks might know that this was put together by 13 U.S. federal government agencies. It has an incredible richness of resources, also customized to the regional level around a range of climate impacts. It is not a policy prescriptive document, but it clearly highlights the need for urgent action.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel Licker or Michael Simpson, do either of you want to comment on that question?
Sure, I can. There is a lot of research, at the sort of really at the granular scale. For example, co-benefits to urban trees, to community well-being, and other aspects of air pollution, carbon sequestration. There were basically the quantifications have been monetized in research projects, so there's no one depository for that, but there is quite a bit of research out there. And I also just might mention that in the spring term, we teach a 1-credit graduate module to our climate certificate that's just focused on financing and economics impacts to adaptation in the changing climate.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I think, for people who want to go deeper into how to do that economic analysis, the cost-benefit analysis, how to frame that for local decision makers who are making decisions about their capital improvement programs, about their operating budgets, the course that Michael has just referenced is a way to do that, because it's very hands-on and pragmatic about how you would actually go about framing those arguments and doing that analysis. I want to go to a question from Dr. Susie Mosier. Susie is research faculty here at Antioch. Susie writes, how did you account for some degree of acclimatization that humans are capable of? So the thresholds of when something is harmful may shift upward, at least to some extent. So I guess Susie's asking, how adaptable are we as a species to extreme heat? And then she says, thanks for the great work.
I can take that. So we did not account for acclimatization in that sense. We looked purely at pre-existing, or not pre-existing, but at the thresholds that I mentioned. We hope that this report will lay the groundwork for additional work that could get at some of that. For example, a couple of things that I didn't mention, we looked specifically at the number of days above the threshold during what we refer to as the warm season, so April through October. And it could be interesting to see, how do the number of days of extreme heat change, at the outskirts of that heat season, and perhaps with something like that creeping up of number of heat waves and extreme heat events in times that aren't characteristically hot for a given location, maybe we could get at some of that. So with the current analysis that we're talking about here, we're hoping it's sort of the foundational analysis that we can use to get at some of that other line of inquiry. One thing I realized I also just wanted to note, I think I misspoke when I mentioned what our historical period is. I just want to make sure I get that right. So we looked at the 30-year period of 1971 to 2000. But I just want to correct myself in case I got that wrong.
Yeah. Just a couple of things to add to that based on our analysis. There are limits to what the human body can adjust to. And one of the results that Rachel highlighted was those off-the-charts days, which are really not ones that we can adapt to. So the runaway climate change scenario is not one that really the human body is physiologically able, in some cases, to adapt to the extremes. The other piece that we wanted to point out, which I think Rachel showed in maps, is we do see certain parts of the country, the southwest and the southeast of the country, with these really high hot days. But just as important are places in the northeast that aren't used to this kind of heat. And the effect that you start seeing when people, buildings are just not actually currently set up to cope with this heat. And the global analog, I would say, is that yes, it's true that countries like India and Pakistan are used to heat but the kind of record heat that they've been seeing is killing thousands of people. In places in Europe, it's the same thing. In Northern Europe, they just haven't had air conditioning because they haven't needed it. And now we have these extended periods of heat waves. So when we think about acclimatization, we have to think both about the physical body, but also the spaces in which we live and how quickly we can actually adapt. And I would really caution that some of the extreme scenarios are not ones that we can actually cope with. That's why the choice frame is important. That's why we have led with that choice frame throughout the report. We do have a very important choice here in cutting global warming emissions.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So I think this is a nice segue to this next question. This is from Jeannie Economos, and Jeannie is really drawing attention to very vulnerable populations, specifically refugee populations. And her statement and her question: we work with migrants from Mexico and Central America, some of whom traverse the desert as climate refugees from their home countries to get to the US. Has your analysis looked at all the projected heat index and temperature levels just over the US-Mexico border? That is of great concern for those who are fleeing climate impact effects, only to be victims again if they are forced to migrate.
Can I just clarify? So the question is, did we look at conditions across the border, so including parts of Mexico, or specifically at the U.S., at the border with Mexico?
What she's really getting at is right at the border, right along the U.S. side of that border. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we looked at the entire lower 48 states, and I maybe just can use that as an opportunity to get at another question real quick that asked why we didn't include Alaska and Hawaii, and that was a data availability issue. We only have projections for the lower 48 states to work with, and we hope that in the future we could potentially expand that analysis, including to places like Puerto Rico as well. So back to this particular question. So yes, we looked all the way right up to the border with Mexico, and certainly with respect to the conditions that people could be subject to while right after crossing the border, the analysis includes that. We don't have information on push factors, so the extreme heat conditions that people could have been subject to that could have driven them or contributed to the moves. Just will note that existing research on migration and the climate links does show some relationship in different countries with temperature and migration decisions. There's been research, for example, in Pakistan and some countries in Africa. There has been some research with the Mexico-U.S. migration link, specifically looking at effects on people who work in the agricultural sector, and crop yields being reduced, and there being sort of an economic impetus for people moving. So there is some preliminary research on that. A couple of things to note on that, too, is that most migration decisions that are made, generally speaking, including with respect to climate, are such that people tend to first move within the country instead of moving internationally. And then the other thing to note is that, there's the impetus to move away from a hazard, but migration does require some resources. And so, unfortunately, you can also see situations in which the most vulnerable people are not actually able to move because they are stuck and don't have the resources. So yeah, we don't know, what people will necessarily be able to withstand. And this study doesn't quite get, wouldn't get at that situation with respect to Mexico or anywhere south in Central America to the United States, but certainly could speak to some of the conditions that people will be exposed to in the United States.
Yeah. And I just want to highlight again for people who are on the broadcast that UCS has this incredible tool, an interactive tool you can go into it, you can put your municipality, you can put your county in, and it's going to very quickly tell you what the projections are for extreme heat days going forward. So, you know, you could put in any location in the United States and you'll get that information. So,
yeah, and we also have this information available in Spanish. So especially for these populations, we have projections there for Texas, Arizona, et cetera. You can see all of those border states, and you can see that information in Spanish as well.
yeah, wonderful.
And I just
Okay.
want to jump in here and you know, looking at how states and communities have developed their plans, you do not often see the communication translated into the languages of their minority populations. Even the LA, if you go to the LA site and look at their cooling centers, that site is in English. And so I can't overemphasize that you need to take a accounting of your most disadvantaged minorities, and then you need to create communication for them specifically.
And kudos to UCS for already doing that. Okay, so I'm going to pose this next question, and then I actually have to log off the broadcast because I need to get ready to present to our AAAS S&T policy fellows. But here's the final question that I'll pose to our panelists. It's a good pragmatic question. It says, can this report be used to form the basis for efforts to change municipal building codes to mitigate for the impacts from extreme heat? And I think the answer is probably yes. And then to you, the panelists, the question is how? How could this report be used in that way?
I'll start and then I'll pass it over. You can, and actually for any changes that are going to build the resiliency of the community for all the impacts from the changing climate, you basically can tie it to any renovations of already developed areas, so that if they're going to redevelop or re-improve properties, that they have to meet new requirements that can be brought in. The other way is through, not all communities have this, but through planning boards and planning departments, where basically if they're going to do a development, they have to institute very specific land use planning requirements, which include basically structures and setbacks and mitigation efforts on the plan itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just to add to that briefly, I think the most important thing that we're trying to do here is make sure that as we're making investments that are going to be long-lived investments, that we're taking into account these future conditions, not just building for the past. And when it comes to cooling and the spaces in which we live, work, and play, I think there's a somewhat simplistic idea sometimes that we can just air condition our way out of this problem, and that comes with its own challenges. You know, air conditioning increases energy demand and stress on the power grid. If that power is coming from fossil fuels, we're talking about increased emissions. So we really have to be thinking about smart design, including urban planners and architects in the conversation. So we're talking about passive cooling features, efficiency, urban shading. There's a range of features we should be thinking about. And most importantly, we need to make sure that this is not just available to an elite, rich part of the population, but is really available to everybody who needs it. Unfortunately, our past efforts in investing in urban greening have often left low-income communities and communities of color at a disadvantage. And some of the research that Michael shared points out how the urban heat island effect is worsened in some of these communities. So we have a chance to prepare for a future of extreme heat, but also a chance to set right some of the inequities of the past as we do it.
Let me step in for Abby at this point and just follow up on that same theme from Laurie Montserrat, who says that the immigrant population is just very reluctant to get involved with the medical community and with the local governments for undocumented, immigrant reasons. And so she said, are there anything in your experience dealing with local populations, migrant populations, other than making sure we vote the right way in the next election to make sure we have climate sensitive representatives at all levels of government.
Well, I can say when we try to intervene in a community and provide them enough facilitation so they can make their own decisions about their future, we don't go directly to populations like that. We go to organizations that already have their trust. They may be religious organizations, they may be social organizations, and work with them to work with their communities and go through a process where we start to pull them in so that the process has trust, not necessarily us. And so we find it's a very effective way to sort of reach out to communities that are often wary of any sort of outside entity coming in and telling them what to do.
We ran a webinar about a year or so ago with Arizona State University and the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, where there were representatives from Detroit and really devastated parts of Louisiana because of the various hurricanes that are down there, that had exactly the same answer, Michael, is that you've got to bring trusted not necessarily officials, but trusted representatives into the conversation to get people to move in that direction. There was a question about nighttime heating, and I lost it, so I can't say who had said it, but it's a question for both Rachels. Does your analysis take into account the difference between nighttime heating and daytime heating, that there's more severe change at the nighttime during the day, I think was the point of that question. I don't know if that's true or not, so let's start there.
Yeah, well, first of all, for starters, we've seen the trend with respect to nighttime temperatures over the last several decades has been steeper than that of maximum temperatures here in the United States and globally. But we are looking, I actually realized I failed to mention the fact that we looked at daily maximum heat index values. Apologies, that wasn't clear. Yeah, so we didn't look at minimum nighttime temperatures. The reason that we chose to look specifically at maximum daily heat index values was because we wanted to understand the conditions that people would be exposed to during peak conditions outdoors, for example. And certainly, you know, a natural follow-on could be to look at those nighttime temperatures. Certainly, that is something that is really serious with respect to vulnerability. You know, when people don't have that opportunity to cool off and get relief from heat at night, that can really increase the risk of heat-related illness.
Great, and that question was actually asked by Janine Fennell, who's been on quite a number of our webinars, so thank you, Janelle, for that. Rachel, did you find a question in there that was particularly of interest to you?
This Rachel or that Rachel? Or I guess
because I know you were looking. But check the see what you think, and I'm going to ask.
Sorry, I there were a number. I was scrolling through them. If either of the other speakers have one that pops out, I can take a moment to come up with an answer.
I do have a follow-on question overall, probably for Michael, about local climate action. But in terms of getting people to realize the impact of heat, because heat isn't just heat, it's all of the other things that you mentioned, including public health. What are barriers that you see, or what are the best approaches to get governments especially to come on board to develop climate action plans that really consider heat now rather than waiting a decade or two?
I think the report is real eye-opening and will be for local communities, because what really resonates with the local community is one of two things: is what they've experienced in the past, and so they'll rank their hazards based on that, and or what they've seen in the press in their local region as being something that is of concern. So trying to get them to focus on heat, especially as you move into the northern latitudes of this country, is going to be a challenge to have them do it. And that's why I think the web-based tool and the information that UCS has developed actually provides me better legitimate, scientific, legitimate information that I can then pass on to communities as I take them through a planning process to, build resilience and come up with adaptation strategies.
Great. Okay, Rachel, something that comes to mind, or do you have a response to that or another question?
Another question. I wanted to answer a question of clarification. There was a participant who asked about the way that we do or don't consider the urban heat island effect, and I just wanted to clarify that we took it into account insofar as it currently affects the number of days that traverse these different thresholds that we mentioned. We don't single it out, but to the extent that it contributes to any city having days above these thresholds, we do take it into consideration in terms of the historical value. What I was referring to was that we don't do any sort of dynamic land use modeling where we look at how land use could change in the future, and therefore additional expansion, additional urbanization could further exacerbate some of the patterns that we see. One caveat that I will say in that is that we were using these gridded climate data sets, which average weather station values for particular areas, and in that averaging, that could potentially reduce the signal of an urban heat island in an area. We had that come up, for example, someone asked about that in Baltimore, actually. That would be of interest to Michael, that there are certain parts like in the Inner Harbor that could be even hotter than some of our historical values show. But that's really something that is sort of a trade-off when you're looking nationally with these large data sets. That sometimes that vary even finer than we looked at the fine level data. Some of those things can get averaged over, but by and large, we hope that this information is quite accurate.
Great. Actually, there were a couple of questions about international use of the toolkit and the approach overall and the conclusions. Oforo Kimambo, who's offline now, and asked that question, and there was one earlier as well. Have you had demand for extending the analysis to other countries, or can what you've discovered, or can this report be used by other nations?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have the data sets and the wherewithal to extend the analysis to other countries. We've also been doing a lot of analysis in the space of sea level rise, where we, again, it has been for the lower 48 states of the U.S. We do recognize, of course, that these are global challenges. We think that in the solution space, there is a lot of information here that will be useful to other countries, other places. But one of the things that we are trying to do here is point out here in the U.S. context, in a way that brings it home where people live, how much we are part of the global effort to curtail climate change. We're not going to be able to do this on our own, any one country. And so it is our hope that researchers in other places, and we look forward to hearing from folks if there's any way we can collaborate offline to share our methodology. If you have access to data sets, we would be more than willing to collaborate, but we unfortunately don't have the ability to replicate this for other countries. Rachel, I don't know if you want to add to that in any way.
No, I think that's right. We have gotten requests, and there's certainly interest, and hopefully this can serve as a framework. We try to be as transparent as possible with respect to our methodology, and we certainly, just as peers and colleagues in the scientific community, hope that we can be helpful in terms of helping anyone else conduct this kind of analysis and think about how they might do it. I mean, one thing I will note, though, is we did use the National Weather Service heat index equation, which is a parameter, a variable that's specifically used in the United States. Certainly, is relevant to other countries, but other national weather services in other countries might use something different. So if someone was interested in doing something similar, they might just there might be the need to look into that aspect.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say in many ways, and Michael, you may agree, that it's the overall impact of the study rather than individually, whether it's 10 extra days or 12 extra days. We're talking about a lot of additional days of high heat impact, all across the United States and by extension, all across the world.
Well, it's also the spatial granularity that's really important here. There's a number of downscaled studies that you can find around the United States looking at this, but they're very rare. And so having this across the United States, this spatial granularity is very powerful.
Right. So we've come up to the end of the hour. We still have more questions left. One question that sort of cut across several of the audience inputs was the resource and resource list. Some of them were specific and some of them more general, but we'll work to get a resource list out to everyone, things that are talked about here and some PDFs that were mentioned by audience members out to everyone. The video will be posted either tonight or tomorrow morning. You'll all get an email with it and the slides and any other downloads that we've had here, so take a look at that. I'd like to spend the last minute or two with just a summary statement from each of you. So let's start with Rachel Licker, and then Rachel Cletus, and then Michael. Just a closing thought for the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much again for the opportunity to share the results of our report. We really appreciate the chance to be able to reach out and get the results into also a practitioner space. And yeah, I mean, we're really hoping in the next year here at UCF to think about extending this analysis into additional areas, with respect to economic sectors and different demographics. And we really are interested in any ideas that people might have and feel could be interesting to think about. So please feel free to reach out with any thoughts.
Rachel?
Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to put my climate advocate hat on and encourage you all to join the Global Climate Strike on September 20th, which, as you know, young people are leading the way, telling us that inaction is not acceptable. This is about their futures. I know many of you might have young people in your own lives, and they're actually asking us to turn out and support them as they demonstrate leadership and stand up to the lack of political will we've seen. So be there for them, and it's really important as we do this that we're informed by good science of the type that Rachel and I shared today, but there's a lot of really important science that's out there from the IPCC, from the National Climate Assessment, that can be used to formulate the kinds of solutions that will better protect us now and better protect our children and grandchildren going forward.
Yeah, I guess I'll close with 2 points. I want to reemphasize Rachel Cletus's point that, heating is already in the atmosphere, and if we don't address mitigation, we're going to see their scenarios, the extreme scenarios they presented, as the reality. And secondly, it takes time to revamp systems, both institutional, political, and infrastructure systems. And so you can expect that if you started today, it's going to, you're looking at maybe 5, 10, 15 years to really change systems at the community level to address this. And so if we wait that long, we're going to find ourselves in a lot worse shape, because the increase in frequency and scale of the impacts are going to be such that what we plan for today actually may have already changed.
I think that's a great point. The Union of Concerned Scientists really made the clarion call with this report, and Michael, the adaptation solutions that you went over are the pathway forward, but what you say about investment in infrastructure is absolutely correct. You've got to start the planning process now because there are capital investments involved. But the encouraging news here is that there are solutions that can be implemented from an adaptation standpoint, separate from mitigation, which is in a way the ultimate solution. And since we're not moving so fast on mitigation, adaptation really does take center stage. So thank you all for your contributions. I thought it was a terrific set of presentations. I thought it fit together really well. Michael, thank you for stepping in to participate and add your expertise in Antioch University, New England's expertise to climate action. And thank you, Rachel and Rachel, for great work and a great, just a great answers to questions as well. So thank you. And I want to remind you about the NCSE conference. You get a chance to talk about the issues that we're talking about here and more. They've given you a discount that's on this code, that's on this slide, and also in the chat box for coming to Washington to take advantage of what I think is one of the best science and science policy integration conferences that's given every year. And I have to say I haven't missed one in years. Please take a look at the webinars we have coming up. They're all free. They're stored in the archives at the Security and Sustainability Forum. There's 220 of them there. We have another one this week on mini grids, another one next week on the status of taking carbon out of the air, which is really sort of the elephant in the room. What do we do about the carbon that's there? And another webinar coming up in October on municipal finance for climate action, really, really important. And one that I think you'll find really interesting, how to use big data to answer sustainability questions. And this one is an application that's being used by municipal bond funds to assess risk at the local level. So with that, let me thank the panelists one more time and thank the audience for sticking with us right to the end. A majority of you did. I think over 500 people were actually on the call overall, so that's just a great, it just shows a great deal of interest in this topic, so thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to end the webinar.
Thanks, Ed.